We have fought against each other, then reconciled, then fought, then reconciled again. And we have bled and died side by side on battlefields from Kapyong to Kandahar. And I'm here today to leave it clear that America is charting the path for a new century of prosperity, and that once again, we want to do it together with you, our cherished allies and our oldest friends. We should be proud of what we achieved together in the last century, but now we must confront and embrace the opportunities of a new one. Because yesterday is over. The future is inevitable, and our destiny together awaits. Thank you. We are part of one civilization, Western civilization. We are bound to one another by the deepest bonds that nations could share, forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry, and the sacrifices our forefathers made together for the common civilization to which we have fallen heir. And so this is why we Americans may sometimes come off as a little direct and urgent in our counsel. This is why President Trump demands seriousness and reciprocity from our friends here in Europe. The reason why, my friends, is because we care deeply. We care deeply about your future and ours. And if at times we disagree, our disagreements come from our profound sense of concern about a Europe with which we are connected, not just economically, not just militarily. We are connected spiritually, and we are connected culturally. We want Europe to be strong. We believe that Europe must survive. Because the two great wars of the last century serve for us as history's constant reminder that ultimately our destiny is and will always be intertwined with yours.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio has delivered remarks at the Munich Security Conference, claiming America still wants to be an ally of European nations. Here's CNN's Fred Plodkin.
High-stakes security conference coming to an end here in Munich, Germany. Of course, one of the highlights was U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and his speech in front of the delegates here in Munich. And basically, the folks who are here breathing a sigh of relief after that speech. On the one hand, the U.S. Secretary of State criticizing America's European allies, but also extending a welcoming hand, saying that the United States wants to continue to be an ally of European nations. At the same time, the U.S. is trying to move along that negotiations process to try and end the war in Ukraine. The next round of talks is set to happen in Geneva in Switzerland in the next couple of days, involving, of course, the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia. Now, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, he showed some frustration at the way the talks are going. Here's what he had to say.
The Americans often return to the topic of concessions. And too often those concessions are discussed in the context only of Ukraine, not Russia. Europe is practically not present at the table. It's a big mistake to my mind.
Now, when Zelensky speaks about concessions, he first and foremost, of course, means some of those territorial concessions the Ukrainians might have to make as part of any peace agreement.
Well, for more on that and for more on Rubio's speech, let's bring in our political analyst, Joe Syracuse, for his thoughts on this. So what did you make of Rubio's address, Joe?
Good morning, Pete. Actually, Marco Rubio looked very presidential in Munich. You know, I think he's getting ready for 2028, as a matter of fact. Look, he gave sort of the slightly different version of the speech that Vance gave last year. He's playing the good cop. He's telling the Europeans, well, you know, America was going to have its own way, and if you want to play with us, you're going to have to reform yourself. He's also told the United Nations to get to the back of the line. They have to reform themselves. And that he's made it very clear that while he has a softer approach, he has the same things in mind as President Trump. That is, that Europe has to get itself in order here. And I think it was a very tough speech in many ways. And it was the thing that struck me is he says at the beginning that globalization, that is the concept of global citizens, was a disappointment. It was a failed mission, as a matter of fact. So, you know, he's looking for the post-globalization world. I'm not quite sure what that looks like. But he did reassure the Europeans, and I've been to a number of these conferences, Pete, and, you know, they're all sitting around sort of looking at the tea leaves here, trying to figure out what's between the lines. And he made it very clear that the mood in Washington hasn't changed, though the delivery is a little different this time.
Yeah, but he's right on all those points, isn't it? Europe does need to do more. And you've already seen from the Trump administration his attempts to get Europe to pay more when it comes to defence, and they've eventually come to the table there. But, I mean, the US is leading the way when it comes to, you know, putting pressure on Russia and Putin over the war in Ukraine, and all of the work that the White House is doing in the Middle East that Europe has clearly been lacking in.
Oh, he's absolutely right. Europe has to do a lot more. Look, Pete, in my lifetime, and been following American foreign policy and European-American relations all my life, Europe hasn't done nearly enough. You know, they've been free riding since the early Cold War. You know, they haven't paid their dues. They've never paid their part of defense. And, you know, it was quite clear that they were leaning very heavily on the American extended nuclear deterrence. They were always counting on America to bail them out. Now they got a president who says, well, unless you put up, you know, unless you fight, it look like you're ready to fight, we're not going to help anyway. You know, America's got that old saying, I suppose the Australians do too, that they're only prepared to help those who help themselves. And it looks like, you know, Europe has enjoyed the free ride. And if it isn't Trump, it had been someone else who would have said to them, look, you got to pay your fair share of this. And if you don't, well, we're just going to part ways. And Trump has no emotional attachment to Europe. That is, he's prepared to turn his back on them. And no matter how they feel about Russia or Zelensky or anything else, I mean, they don't agree on a lot of things. But, you know, Pete, the Europeans are waiting for Donald Trump to leave the scene. They've been reassured by Democrats who attended, particularly Newsom, that there's only 3 more years of this to go.
Yeah,
well, actually, that's not true. You know, there's more than 3 years. America, Go ahead.
So what are they going to do? I mean, if a Democrat wins the next election, do they just go back to the way things were?
Well, they're going to pretend they can. You know, some Democrats going to say we're back again the way Joe Biden did. But look, you know, they're going to have to spend more on defense. They're going to have to think more. And look, Pete, there are 450 million Europeans in the European Union. There are only 340 million Americans. You know, you can't tell me that the Europeans can't defend themselves one day. I mean, we're looking for them to become a major player instead of just hanging on the United States. And Trump doesn't want them hanging on because he wants his own freedom to maneuver. The Europeans haven't decided what Europe really is. You know, maybe the European Union is a failed experiment. They gave it a good go. They think they've averted.
Agree on that.
Well, yeah, I agree too. And look, and I've said years ago in conferences in Melbourne when we had European ambassadors here, I said, you can't have all these nations claiming to have a single foreign policy when all of them also belong to NATO, which is completely reliant on the United States. So these guys have depended too long on the U.S. to pull them out of the fire. But they're big boys. They've been around a long time. But I liked Rubio's simple message. Get on board or get out. And he made it very clear he can live without them.